heavy fog rolled through the streets of London, clinging to the cobblestone alleys as though it sought to swallow the entire city. Sherlock Holmes sat in his study, silent except for the rhythmic tapping of his fingers on the armrest of his chair. His eyes narrowed as he examined the scene unfolding before him, each element of the mystery pressing against the boundaries of his keen mind. It had been 3 days since the crime, 3 days since the murder of Lord Reginald Stanhope, a man of wealth and influence found dead in his private study. The scene was bizarre. The door had been locked from the inside. The windows, secured with thick iron bars, had remained untouched. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of a weapon, no footprints leading to or from the scene. Lord Stanhope's body lay on the floor, his face pale, his eyes wide open in a final terrified expression. The only clue was a single unmarked envelope left on his desk. Inside the envelope was a letter, written in a precise, elegant hand, but the contents defied explanation. "I have spoken to the dead. They have told me things you would not believe." This cryptic message, so simple and yet so absurd, had confounded the police. They had no suspects, no motive, and no possible explanation. There was no sign of a struggle, no physical harm to the body, just the unsettling message, a clue that seemed to mock any logical attempts to solve the case. Detective Gregson of Scotland Yard had requested Holmes's help the moment the letter was discovered. The mystery was beyond even his seasoned abilities, and he had not hesitated to involve the great detective. Holmes, ever eager to embrace a challenge, had already begun his investigation. His first step had been to speak with the household staff, but none had been present when the crime occurred, and none had any idea of how the crime was committed. The butler, a gaunt man named Edward Parish, had been the first to find the body. He claimed to have been delivering a cup of tea to his master's study when he discovered Lord Stanhope lying motionless on the floor, his body cold to the touch. Parish insisted that no one had entered the study since the night before, and no one had heard any disturbances. Holmes had meticulously examined the room, scanning every inch for the faintest trace of a clue. The furniture was arranged as it had been the day before, and the fire in the hearth was still smouldering. Lord Stanhope's personal effects were undisturbed, and there were no signs of forced entry. The only anomaly was the letter, its content, both absurd and unnerving. It was the letter that Holmes found most perplexing. In all his years of solving mysteries, he had never encountered such a strange and seemingly nonsensical clue. Yet there was something about it that called to him, as if it held the key to unlocking the crime. Perhaps it is not the message itself, but the manner in which it was delivered, Holmes muttered aloud to himself. Who would leave such a letter? And why? There must be some deeper meaning hidden within it. Holmes sat at his desk, pacing back and forth, trying to decipher the letter's cryptic words. He reached for his violin, allowing the familiar strains of the instrument to clear his mind. As the haunting melody filled the room, an idea began to form. A theory, a direction. The notion of speaking to the dead. It was absurd, but what if it wasn't? What if the letter was not a riddle, but a clue to the true nature of the crime? He looked at Watson, who had been sitting quietly, watching his friend with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Watson," Holmes said, his eyes alight with an idea, "the answer to this mystery may not lie in the realm of the living. It may be within the world of the dead." Watson looked puzzled, but before he could respond, Holmes was already moving toward the door. "We're going to see someone who can help us. Someone who knows more about this than we ever could." The two detectives made their way to an address in the less reputable district of Whitechapel. The building was tucked away on a narrow street, its exterior weathered and worn by years of neglect. Holmes approached the door with a purposeful stride and knocked sharply. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a woman of indeterminate age, dressed in dark, somber clothing. Her eyes were sharp, yet her face was lined with the heavy weight of many years spent in shadows. "I assume you are here about Lord Stanhope," the woman said without preamble. "Come in, then." Holmes and Watson followed her into a dimly lit room. The air was thick with incense, and the shelves were lined with strange objects, crystal balls, antique books, and strange trinkets that spoke of the occult. The woman gestured for them to sit. "I am Madame Vesperah," she said, her voice low and mysterious. "You seek answers that few dare to ask, but I can help you." Holmes did not flinch. He had dealt with mediums and fortune-tellers before, though he had always been skeptical of their methods. Still, he knew when a mystery required all possible avenues to be explored. "The letter that was found with Lord Stanhope's body, what do you make of it?" Holmes inquired, his voice calm yet pressing. Madame Vesperah's eyes narrowed as she examined the words of the letter. She took a deep breath, as if allowing the energy in the room to settle. Then, with a grave expression, she spoke. "The dead do speak, Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "but only to those who are willing to listen. What Lord Stanhope discovered was far darker than you could imagine." Holmes leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What do you mean?" Madame Vesperah hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "There are forces at work that most cannot comprehend. Lord Stanhope, in his quest for knowledge, sought to contact the spirits, something he should not have done. In doing so, he opened a door that could never be closed again." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And what happened after that?" "He began to hear their voices," she whispered, her voice trembling. "At first they were distant, whispers in the dark, but soon they became more insistent. He could not stop them. They consumed him." "Consumed him?" Watson asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Madame Vesperah nodded. "Yes, the spirits were angry. He had crossed a boundary, and they sought their revenge." Holmes's mind whirred with the implications of this new information. A man driven mad by the spirits of the dead. It seemed unlikely, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The letter, the cryptic message, it was not just a warning, but a confession. Holmes stood up abruptly, his decision made. "Watson, I believe we must return to the scene of the crime. There is something we have overlooked." They hurried back to Lord Stanhope's mansion, their minds racing with the possibilities. As they entered the study once again, Holmes's sharp eyes swept the room with renewed focus. There was something in the air, a lingering presence, as if the very walls held the secrets of the past. Holmes approached the desk, his gaze fixed on the letter. "It was not the living who killed Lord Stanhope," he muttered, "but the dead." Suddenly, as if in response, the room grew colder, and the faintest whisper seemed to echo through the air, a whisper only Holmes could hear. And then it clicked. The hour. Murder had not been committed by a person, but by the unseen forces Lord Stanhope had dared to contact. The spirits had claimed their revenge, and in doing so had left behind a clue, a final cryptic message meant for those who dared to follow. The trail. Holmes's gaze swept the room once more, each inch of the study now infused with a different kind of tension. The shadows seemed to lengthen as he focused intently on every object within the confines of the room. Watson, though still unsettled by the occult nature of the case, followed closely, trying to make sense of the cryptic revelations that had been revealed. "What do you see, Holmes?" Watson asked quietly, though he knew his companion's keen eye had already spotted details the average man would overlook. Holmes didn't respond immediately. His eyes flickered from one object to another. The heavy velvet curtains drawn tightly over the windows, the untouched papers scattered across Lord Stanhope's desk, the dimly flickering fire in the hearth. It was the smallest details that drew his attention. A faint indentation in the thick rug beneath the desk, a slight misalignment of the leather chair, and most peculiarly, a seemingly insignificant piece of paper left at the edge of the desk. Holmes moved swiftly, his fingers brushing the edge of the paper with the care of someone handling a fragile artifact. It wasn't a letter. No, this was something different. His eyes narrowed as he examined the paper, noting its texture, the slight crease in the corner, and the faint smell of ink, still fresh despite the passing days. "It seems Lord Stanhope was a man of habits," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. He straightened up, the answer hanging on the tip of his tongue, just out of reach. Watson stepped closer, intrigued. "Another clue?" Watson asked. "No, not exactly," Holmes replied. "This is something far more subtle, a detail easily missed by anyone who isn't looking for it." He turned to the desk and pointed toward the paper. "This is not a letter or an important document. It's part of a page from an old journal, a personal one likely. Notice the ink, faded, as if it was written long ago." Watson raised an eyebrow. "A journal?" "Precisely," Holmes said, picking up the small fragment carefully between his fingers. "Lord Stanhope was more than just a wealthy man. He was a man with interests that perhaps brought him into contact with something he shouldn't have." Holmes placed the fragment aside and began to pace the room, a gesture Watson had come to recognize as the precursor to one of his sudden insights. "The letter," Holmes continued, "while it may seem like the focal point of this mystery, is not the key. It is an omen. But the journal, this is a more personal item. It connects Lord Stanhope directly to the events before his death." Holmes turned sharply, his eyes landing on Edward Parish, the butler, who had lingered quietly in the doorway, unsure of whether to enter. His presence seemed almost deliberate, as though he had been waiting for the right moment to speak. His eyes were fixed on the detective, a mixture of unease and something else, something that Holmes had already begun to detect, though the meaning of it remained just out of grasp. "Mr. Parish," Holmes said, his voice firm but without accusation, "I wonder if you could tell me a bit more about Lord Stanhope's activities leading up to his death." The butler shifted uncomfortably. "My lord, he was not himself in the weeks before. The tragedy, sir," he stammered. "There were things he said, strange things. He began to act erratically as though he were—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Haunted." "Haunted?" Watson asked, leaning forward, his curiosity piqued. Parish nodded, his expression growing distant as though recalling a deeply unsettling memory. "Yes. He would sometimes sit in the study for hours, speaking to no one. At first I thought he was merely ill, stressed perhaps, but then—" He swallowed hard. Then he started speaking aloud, as though he was responding to someone, and not just any voice, a voice that was not his own. The air in the room grew heavy. Holmes and Watson exchanged a glance. It was becoming increasingly clear that Lord Stanhope's involvement with the spiritual world was not just a fleeting curiosity. It was something far more dangerous, a door that had been opened without regard for the consequences. Holmes, however, wasn't satisfied. Did he mention anything about a particular individual? Perhaps someone who might have influenced him? Parish's face contorted, as though he was struggling with the words. There was someone, he whispered, his voice barely audible. A man who came to see him on the nights before the incident. A man, Watson echoed. Who was this person? I don't know his name, sir, Parish said, shaking his head. He was a stranger, always wearing a dark cloak and hood. I never saw his face, but every time he came, my lord seemed more agitated, as if the man had power over him. Holmes's eyes gleamed with a sudden understanding. A man with power, he murmured, his tone thoughtful. A man who might be more than he appears. Turning sharply, Holmes faced Parish once more. You will take us to where Lord Stanhope met with this man. Lead us to the place where these strange meetings took place. Without another word, Parish hesitated, then nodded. His eyes darted nervously toward the door, as though half expecting something, or someone, lurking just beyond it. He slowly made his way to the back of the study, past a small door that led into a narrow hallway. As they followed him down the dim corridor, Holmes's mind raced, piecing together the scant details they had gathered. A cloaked man, a mysterious visitor, a strange connection to the supernatural. It was all beginning to form a picture, though the full scope of it remained tantalizingly out of reach. They arrived at a small, almost forgotten door at the back of the house, tucked away beneath a winding staircase. The door creaked open, revealing a tiny room filled with old bookshelves and dusty artifacts. It was here, Parish explained, that Lord Stanhope had received his strange visitor. Holmes stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room with laser focus. Nothing seemed out of place, but Holmes's attention was drawn to a small, leather-bound book lying on the floor, half hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers. He knelt down, lifting it carefully. This, Holmes said quietly, this is what I've been searching for. Watson's heart quickened as Holmes flipped open the cover, revealing a series of strange symbols and cryptic writings. A journal, I presume, Watson asked, his voice laced with awe. Not just a journal, Holmes replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. This is the journal of the man who spoke to the dead. Holmes's fingers lingered on the pages of the leather-bound journal, his mind already working through the implications of its contents. The symbols were not of any language Holmes had seen before, but their design hinted at something ancient, something tied to rituals far removed from the rational world. He closed the journal with a soft snap, his gaze flickering to Watson, who stood by the door, visibly tense. Do you recognize any of these symbols? Watson asked, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing at the mysterious characters. Holmes shook his head slowly. No, but I believe they are part of a language not meant to be understood, certainly not by someone of our time. Whoever left this journal behind knew what they were doing, or perhaps knew what they were summoning. The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. The sense of dread that had crept in earlier now felt almost tangible. Holmes placed the journal aside carefully, as though the knowledge contained within it could shatter the very foundations of reality. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel. "We need to question the witnesses again, Watson. There's something they're not telling us." They returned to the heart of the mansion, where the investigation had begun. Edward Parish led them to the sitting room, where the rest of the household staff had gathered, each person awaiting further questioning. Holmes's eyes roamed the group, noting their reactions, the butler's nervous twitches, the young maid's downcast eyes, and the housekeeper, who seemed far too composed for someone who had witnessed the aftermath of a tragic death. Holmes wasted no time. "Let's begin with you, Miss Granger," he said, addressing the maid who had been tending to the house. "You were in the vicinity when Lord Stanhope died, yes?" The young woman nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Yes, sir. I was cleaning the drawing room just down the hall." "And did you hear anything unusual during that time?" Holmes asked, his voice smooth but sharp, piercing through her nervousness. Miss Granger hesitated, her eyes flickering to the floor before meeting his gaze. "No, sir, nothing at all." "Are you sure?" Holmes pressed, his voice calm but insistent. "No voices, no sounds of a struggle, no change in the atmosphere of the house?" Her face flushed, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Well, I did hear something, but it was very faint. I didn't think much of it. A whispering. It was soft, almost like someone was speaking in another room." Holmes's interest peaked, his attention sharpening. "What kind of whispering?" "I couldn't make out the words," she replied quickly, "but it was as though someone was having a conversation, but there was no one else there." "Did you tell anyone about this?" Watson interjected, leaning forward with a furrowed brow. I didn't think it was important, sir," she stammered, "and I didn't want to be a bother. The house is full of strange noises sometimes." Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. He studied Miss Granger for a moment longer, then turned to the next witness, a portly man in his late 50s who had served as Lord Stanhope's cook for nearly 2 decades. His name was Henry, though Holmes had already noted how the man seemed to shrink under his gaze as though hiding something. "Mr. Henry," Holmes began, his voice measured, "you were in the kitchen preparing dinner when Lord Stanhope passed away?" "Yes, sir," Henry said, his hands wringing together nervously. "I was just finishing up for the night. I didn't hear a thing, not until Mr. Parish came to tell me about the tragedy." "You didn't hear anything unusual earlier in the day?" Holmes pressed. "Any sounds that seemed out of place?" The cook paused, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an answer. "Well, now that you mention it, there was a strange noise earlier. I thought I was imagining it at first, just a soft thud, like someone had knocked over a chair or something." "And what time was this?" Holmes asked. "Just after midday, I believe," Henry answered, still reluctant. "But I didn't think it was anything important. I thought it was just the wind or something from upstairs." Holmes's sharp eyes fixed on Henry. "You've been here long enough to know that this house doesn't make those kinds of noises without reason. Are you certain you didn't hear anything more?" Henry's face paled slightly, his hands trembling as they twisted the hem of his apron. I'm sure I didn't hear anything else. Just the wind, sir. You must forgive me." Holmes turned away, a slight frown tugging at his lips. The contradictions were beginning to pile up. Each witness seemed to be hiding something, offering half-truths or evading direct answers. And yet, no one had given Holmes the full picture. There was something off about the way each person reacted to the murder, an undercurrent of fear or, worse, guilt, that they refused to address. Holmes's gaze shifted to the housekeeper, Mrs. Mott, who had remained silent until now. She was older, but her sharp eyes seemed to miss nothing. She had been Lord Stanhope's confidant for many years, trusted with the most intimate details of his life. If anyone had known about his interest in the occult, it would have been her. Mrs. Mott, Holmes said, his voice cutting through the growing tension in the room. I know that you were close to Lord Stanhope. Perhaps you can shed some light on his recent behaviour. Was he acting unusually in the days before his death? The housekeeper's face remained impassive, but her hands tightened around the edge of her shawl. She looked directly at Holmes. Lord Stanhope. He became obsessed, she said softly, with things he shouldn't have been. He became consumed by the idea of speaking to the dead. And did you know of any specific person who might have influenced him in this? Holmes asked, his voice deliberately soft. Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, before she looked away. There were visitors, yes. Strange men, cloaked, always cloaked. I never saw their faces, but I saw the way they spoke to him. It was like they were giving him something he couldn't resist. Giving him something, Watson repeated, his brow furrowing. Mrs. Mott's eyes darkened. Something he couldn't see, but something he could feel. A power, perhaps, or a promise. I don't know. But it changed him. I know that much. Holmes watched her carefully. Her words rang with the unmistakable tone of someone who had seen much but understood little. Still, there was a subtle shift in her demeanour that struck him as odd. Her reluctance was not born out of fear for Lord Stanhope's death, but something far more personal. Did you ever speak with these visitors? Holmes asked, his voice gentle but insistent. No, she whispered, almost inaudibly. I never could. He wouldn't let anyone near them. Holmes stood still for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. The contradictions were mounting now. Too many half-truths, too many veiled glances and nervous responses. Someone in this room was lying, but who? And what were they hiding? He turned away from the group, his eyes sweeping over them once more, each of them suddenly a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Then, as if struck by an epiphany, he snapped his fingers. Watson, I believe we've been looking at this all wrong. Watson's confusion was evident. What do you mean? The key, Holmes said, his voice low and intense, is not in what they're telling us. It's in what they're not telling us. Holmes's mind was already racing ahead, weaving through the conflicting stories, the half-revealed truths, and the subtle evasions that had been laid before him. Each witness was a thread, pulling him in different directions, and yet none of them seemed to offer the answers he sought. The contradictions were no longer just peculiarities. They were deliberate, woven into the fabric of the story, like a trap waiting to be sprung. There's something we're missing, Watson, Holmes muttered, his eyes narrowing as he stood before the fireplace, lost in thought. Each of them has a motive. Each has something to hide, but no single motive explains everything. The puzzle is too tangled, too intricate. Watson, standing just behind him, nodded slowly. You're suggesting that there's more to this than simple greed, or revenge. Exactly, Holmes replied, turning sharply to face his friend. It's not one motive that drives this. It's a combination of them. Greed, fear, revenge, jealousy, they all bleed into one another. But the question is, where does it all connect? Watson looked over the witnesses they had just spoken to. The maid heard something that could have been an outside voice, but it's hardly proof of anything. The cook claims to have heard a noise, but it could have been anything. The housekeeper's words. He paused, searching for the right phrasing. They seem sincere, but there's something unspoken about her involvement. Holmes's eyes flashed with recognition. Exactly. Mrs. Mott knows far more than she's telling. Her tone, her hesitation. There's something personal there. But why does she feel the need to protect those visitors? They must have meant something to her beyond their occult interests. Holmes turned, pacing the length of the room. Let us go over what we know. Lord Stanhope was a man who had wealth, influence and access to knowledge others would kill for. But more importantly, he was a man on the brink of something dangerous. A door was opened, and it was not just his life that was at risk, but everyone in this house. The visitors, these cloaked figures, what did they offer him? Was it power, or was it something darker? Watson followed Holmes's line of thought, trying to connect the dots. And the butler, Parish? His actions seem strange too. He claims to have seen nothing unusual, but his reluctance is telling. He's hiding something. Holmes stopped, his face lighting up with a sudden realization. Parish. He's hiding far more than mere discomfort. He's trying to divert attention away from something. Perhaps he knew about these visitors more intimately than anyone else. That would explain his nervousness, Watson agreed. But his alibi, the fact that he was the one to discover Lord Stanhope's body, could it be a fabrication? I don't believe he was involved in the actual death, Holmes said, tapping his fingers against his chin. But I do believe he knows more than he's letting on. He's trying to protect someone, or something. Icean. It was a game of masks, and Holmes was determined to see through them. We must begin sorting through their alibis, Holmes said, his voice suddenly sharp with resolve. We know that Parish was with the body when it was discovered, but was he the first to arrive? And the maid? She claimed to have heard something, but when? Was it before or after Lord Stanhope died? Watson nodded. That would be crucial. And Mrs. Mott, she said she knew about the cloaked visitors. But how much did she truly know? What role did they play in this? Holmes's eyes glinted with the anticipation of a breakthrough. We will begin by separating their stories, one by one. We'll see where the contradictions lie. Hours later, after much discussion and careful questioning, the web of deception began to unravel, revealing the shadows lurking beneath the polished surfaces of the suspects' alibis. Miss Granger, the maid, had been the most nervous of all. She had admitted to hearing the faint whispering, but the timing had been crucial. Holmes had cross-referenced the details of her statements with the layout of the house, and he discovered a significant contradiction. She had claimed to be cleaning the drawing room when she heard the whispers. But the drawing room was on the opposite side of the house from the study, too far for her to have heard any conversation that could have come from the study's adjoining rooms. It was a small but significant detail. Henry, the cook, had been more forthcoming but no less evasive. He had mentioned hearing a noise, a thud, but it wasn't clear when it occurred. Holmes had pieced together that the noise had likely come from a different room altogether, not the study where Lord Stanhope was found. Furthermore, Holmes had pressed Henry on his movements that evening, and the cook's alibi didn't quite line up with the timeline of events. He had claimed to be preparing dinner, but there was no solid confirmation of his exact whereabouts at the time of Lord Stanhope's death. But it was Mrs. Mott who had provided the most telling piece of information. She had been aware of the visitors, the cloaked figures, but it wasn't just that she had seen them. Holmes had suspected that she had been in direct contact with them, possibly even involved in their rituals. Her reluctance to speak about them had revealed a deeper connection, one that tied her to the events leading up to Lord Stanhope's demise. She had been the one who first introduced him to the dangerous visitors, and now it seemed as if her role in the occult had not only altered his life, but had also ensnared her in a tangled web of motives, fear, guilt, and perhaps even regret. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the pieces of the puzzle scattered across the table before him. Each suspect had a reason to be involved, but none of their motives explained the entirety of the situation. The true motive remained elusive, and as much as the evidence pointed to Mrs. Mott's involvement, something still didn't fit. "I've been thinking, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low, almost to himself. "What if we're looking at this all wrong? What if the key isn't in the motivations we've discovered, but in the lack of a clear motive?" Watson's curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Holmes looked up, his eyes alight with the realization that had been bubbling beneath the surface. The only person whose behavior has been entirely predictable is Parish. Holmes sat motionless in his chair, the dim light from the nearby lamp casting long shadows across the room. His fingers tapped against the surface of the table, not in the rhythm of contemplation, but in impatience. The pieces of the puzzle had shifted again, but the final image refused to reveal itself. As he ran through the details in his mind, something gnawed at him, a small flicker of doubt that lingered just beyond reach. Watson, sitting across from him, glanced at his friend with a furrowed brow. "Holmes, you've been unusually quiet. You don't seem convinced by the latest developments." "I'm not," Holmes replied softly, his gaze fixed on the flickering flame. "There's something wrong about this whole case, Watson. The pieces, they don't fit together as neatly as they should. It's all too perfect." Watson's eyes widened. "You think it's a trap? That someone is trying to mislead us?" Holmes stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't believe the criminal is as eager to be caught as we might think. They've planted this false evidence deliberately, hoping we'd rush to a conclusion." Just as he spoke, the door to the room creaked open, and Edward Parish stepped inside, his face pale, his expression stricken with urgency. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, we have news," he said, his voice tight. "A crucial piece of evidence has come to light. You need to see this at once." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Speak quickly, Mr. Parish. What is it?" "We've found something," Parish continued, stepping closer. "A letter, written by Lord Stanhope himself. It was hidden in the study, tucked behind a bookshelf. It's addressed to an unknown individual, but it mentions the very visitors Mrs. Mott referred to. It also contains references to a meeting planned for the night of his death." Holmes's heart quickened as he exchanged a glance with Watson. This was it, the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Parish handed over the letter, and Holmes took it with care, his mind racing as he read its contents. The writing was unmistakable. Lord Stanhope's hand, shaky with something more than age, but still legible. It was a brief note, but its implications were staggering. The letter spoke of an agreement between Lord Stanhope and a mysterious figure, someone he referred to only as the Speaker. There was mention of a ritual, a pact, and most troubling of all, a phrase that sent chills down Holmes's spine. "The dead speak, and I shall listen. The price will be paid." Holmes set the letter down slowly, his fingers brushing against the parchment as if afraid it might crumble to dust. So, it was true. Lord Stanhope had made a pact, a bargain with the occult, a promise to speak to the dead. His voice was cold, distant as he mulled over the meaning of the words. But why, and who was this speaker? Parish, eager for answers, spoke up. "We've already sent for a linguist to analyze the letter. It's clear that Lord Stanhope was involved in something far darker than we imagined. The authorities are ready to announce that the case is solved. With this letter, it seems clear that he was the victim of a ritual gone wrong. Perhaps one of the visitors turned on him, or—" Holmes held up a hand, silencing him. "No, Mr. Parish. This letter is a clue, but it is not the answer." Parish blinked in confusion. "But the letter matches everything Mrs. Mott told us. It all fits together, doesn't it?" "It fits, yes, but that is precisely why it's dangerous," Holmes replied. "You see, Mr. Parish, a criminal does not make it this easy for us. The timing is too convenient. If this letter were truly the smoking gun, it would have been discovered long before now." Watson, who'd been silently absorbing the new information, furrowed his brow. "You're suggesting that this letter was planted to mislead us?" "Exactly," Holmes said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "And there's another detail we've overlooked. The ritualistic aspects. Lord Stanhope may have been obsessed with speaking to the dead, but he wasn't the only one involved in these dark dealings. The real criminal, the one who killed him, is still in the shadows waiting for us to make a fatal mistake. But the letter, it's clear evidence," Watson said, his tone skeptical. "Too clear," Holmes replied, his gaze flickering to Parish. "It fits too neatly into the story. And consider this. Why would a man like Lord Stanhope, with all his wealth and influence, leave behind such an obvious clue? Wouldn't he have hidden it better? Why place it in a position where it could be found so conveniently?" Parish shifted, uncomfortably. "I don't know. Perhaps it was meant to be discovered, a final message to someone." Holmes stepped closer to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "That's what I suspect. But the timing, the discovery of this letter, it's all too perfect. The authorities will rush to declare the case solved, but I believe we are missing something crucial." The sound of footsteps approached, and a knock echoed through the door. Holmes turned to face the visitor. Inspector Cray, the lead investigator in the case, entered the room, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you won't believe it. We've found the killer. It was one of the visitors, just as you suspected. The letter confirms everything. The occult rituals, the dark dealings, Lord Stanhope's obsession led to his death." Holmes didn't move, his expression unreadable. "Inspector, I would advise caution in your conclusions." Cray's eyebrows knitted together. "But the letter, it's clear. The victim wrote it himself." "Perhaps," Holmes said, his voice low. "But I don't believe the letter holds the answers." "You think it does?" Watson looked between the two men, sensing the tension that hung in the air. "Holmes, if the letter isn't the key, then what is?" Holmes turned sharply, his eyes cold as they met the inspector's. "The true criminal is not one of the occult visitors, Inspector. The answer lies closer to home, and I believe it's time we revisit the one person whose actions have been too consistent, Mr. Parish. Parish's face went pale, his hands suddenly trembling at his sides. "What are you implying?" Holmes's eyes never wavered. "You've been playing us, Mr. Parish. You wanted us to find the letter, to rush to conclusions, but you're not the man you've appeared to be. You've orchestrated this entire charade to cover your own tracks." Watson's gaze flickered. Between the two men, the weight of Holmes's words sinking in, he could see the flicker of panic in Parish's eyes. "Holmes, are you saying that Parish is the murderer?" Holmes nodded slowly, his voice calm and resolute. The letter was just the beginning of his plan. Parish knew that Lord Stanhope's obsession would lead to his downfall. He knew the authorities would believe the occult story and take the bait. But there's more to this than just a ritual gone wrong. Parish had a motive that no one has suspected yet. The room fell silent, and for a moment it seemed as though the truth had finally surfaced. But Holmes knew better. The true game was just beginning. The shadows still held their secrets, and there was much more to uncover before the case could be considered solved. "Inspector, Mr. Parish has been far too eager to help us," Holmes continued, his voice cutting through the silence. "And now, I believe he's ready for his final act. We must stop him before he strikes again." The tension in the room was palpable, each word weighing heavily on the air as Holmes's gaze never left Parish, whose facade of calm was now cracked, revealing the anxiety beneath. For a moment, no one moved, as if they were all waiting for the inevitable to happen, for the trap to close. But Holmes was far from satisfied. The case was not over, not by a long shot. "Inspector Cray," Holmes said, his voice cutting through the silence like a razor. "You must consider something else, something we've overlooked, a connection that, until now, no one has thought to investigate." Cray frowned, clearly bewildered. "What connection, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes glanced at Watson, who nodded, sensing where his friend was going. "A long-forgotten connection, Inspector. The key to this case doesn't lie in occult rituals or hidden letters. It's not in the motives we've pieced together so far. The truth, I believe, is rooted in the past, in something that happened long before Lord Stanhope's death." Cray's skepticism was evident, but Holmes's gaze was unwavering. "I need you to trust me, Inspector. There's more to Parish than meets the eye." The butler's face was ashen now, his knuckles clenched at his sides, but he said nothing. Holmes's mind was already working, piecing together the fragments of the investigation that didn't seem to fit. Bits of evidence that had been passed over in the rush to explain the crime. It was an old habit, one that had served him well over the years. He didn't just follow the path laid before him. He sought out the hidden trails, the forgotten connections. "Let us go back to the beginning," Holmes said, pacing before the fireplace. Lord Stanhope's obsession with the occult. It was not a recent interest. It wasn't something that came out of nowhere. No, his involvement in these dark practices stretches back years, long before any of us ever entered this house. Watson raised an eyebrow, catching on to Holmes's train of thought. "You mean to suggest that the occult rituals weren't just a passing fancy for Stanhope?" "Exactly," Holmes replied, his voice growing firmer. "The rituals had been a part of his life for far longer than anyone knew. And therein lies the answer to our puzzle. The link between the past and the present, the connection between Parish and the murder of Lord Stanhope, goes much deeper than we initially realized." Cray stepped forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. "But how?" What are you getting at, Holmes? Holmes paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Do you remember the name of the woman who was mentioned in the letter? The one to whom Lord Stanhope was supposed to meet that night? The speaker? It's an alias, of course, but it's one that should be familiar to you, Inspector. Cray blinked, a flicker of recognition passing through his eyes. It's familiar. Yes, but I don't recall where I've heard it before. Think back, Holmes pressed. To a case. A long time ago. One that was never truly solved. The death of a woman named Evelyn Carter. The name hung in the air like a dark cloud, and for a brief moment the room felt colder. Watson could see the shift in Cray's expression, the sudden understanding dawning in his eyes. The Evelyn Carter case, Cray muttered. But that was years ago. It was written off as a suicide, wasn't it? She was involved with some sort of occult circle, but there was no proof of foul play. Just rumours. Rumours, Holmes repeated, his voice hard. And yet there were inconsistencies. A strange symbol found at the scene. A note, written in the same shaky hand as Lord Stanhope's letter, found near her body. But no one ever connected the two. The case was closed too quickly, buried under layers of speculation. But now, with Lord Stanhope's death, I believe we have a connection that cannot be ignored. Watson's eyes widened. You think the two are linked? Evelyn Carter and Lord Stanhope? Holmes nodded. I do. Lord Stanhope's involvement in the occult, his dealings with the mysterious visitors, they are part of a larger network, a web of influence that stretches back years. The same network that claimed Evelyn Carter's life. Cray was silent for a moment, his mind racing through the details of the Carter case. But how does Parish fit into this? What does he have to do with the murder of Lord Stanhope? Parish, Holmes said, his voice low, was more than just a servant in this house. He was the one who introduced Lord Stanhope to the occult circle. He was the one who guided him down that dark path. And most importantly, Parish was the one who knew about Evelyn Carter's death. The woman's life and death were part of a tangled series of events, and Parish was there for it all. Cray's face turned pale as realization settled in. You're saying Parish was involved in Carter's death? Holmes's eyes were cold and calculating. In some ways, yes. He may not have directly taken her life, but he was part of the group responsible for her death. The occultists who surrounded her, those who claimed to be able to speak to the dead, they had no qualms about using their influence over others. Evelyn Carter was a victim of their manipulations, just as Lord Stanhope was. And now, Parish has sought to protect the secrets of his past actions, to ensure that no one digs too deeply into the connections between Carter's death and Stanhope's. Parish remained silent, his face a mask of forced calm, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Holmes could see that his mask was slipping. You've been hiding for far too long, Parish, Holmes continued, his voice cutting through the stillness. You've manipulated the people around you, covering up the truth of what happened to Evelyn Carter. But now you've made one critical mistake. You've killed Lord Stanhope, not just to silence him, but to cover your tracks. Cray's face twisted in disbelief. But why? What could Parish possibly gain from killing Stanhope? Power, Holmes replied. Parish has been manipulating the occult dealings for years, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. He knew that once Lord Stanhope began to question his involvement, his own connection to the occult would be exposed. Stanhope wasn't just a victim, He was a threat to Parish's position of control, so Parish had him eliminated. Holmes's gaze never left Parish's face. You thought you had covered your tracks, but you underestimated me, Mr. Parish. You underestimated the reach of the past. For a long moment, the room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Parish's eyes flickered with something, fear perhaps, or anger, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no escaping it now. You can't hide forever, Holmes said softly. The shadows of the past will always find their way into the light. Inspector Cray stepped forward, his hand reaching for his pocketbook. Mr. Parish, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Lord Stanhope and your involvement in the death of Evelyn Carter. As the butler was led away, Holmes allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, though his mind was already racing ahead, processing the next steps. There were still unanswered questions, mysteries yet to unfold. But for now, justice had been served, and the past had finally been brought to light. As Inspector Cray escorted Parish away in cuffs, Holmes's mind did not settle. The immediate tension of the arrest was dissipating, but something in the case still gnawed at him. He had cracked the surface, unearthing hidden connections and motives, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the full truth had yet to be uncovered. There was more to this puzzle, something subtle and elusive, still slipping through his grasp. You were right, Watson said quietly, falling into step beside him as they watched the scene unfold from a distance. Parish was behind it all. The connections to the Carter case, the occult. It all makes sense now. Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowing as he turned away from the window. Yes, Watson. But that's not all. There's still something off about the whole affair, something hidden in the cracks that has yet to come to light. Watson raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? The murder is solved. Parish is the culprit. Not entirely, Holmes replied, his voice low. We have our answers, yes. But there's still a shadow lurking at the edge of the case. Something I missed the first time around. The way Parish reacted when I accused him, it was too controlled, too measured. A man who has spent years hiding his crimes would be more nervous, more desperate. Watson's eyes widened. You think he's hiding something else, even after everything? Holmes's gaze was distant. I don't think Parish is the only one involved. And I don't think he's as clever as he believes. There's more here, Watson. Something he thought he had covered, but a crack in his deception will lead us to the rest. As they stood together, the sounds of the arrest fading into the distance, Holmes's mind was already working. He needed to test something, to push Parish in a way that would reveal his true nature. There was one thing that had always intrigued Holmes about criminals. They always believed they were one step ahead, and that arrogance was their downfall. But it took a certain kind of subtlety to expose that. Watson, I need you to help me with something, Holmes said suddenly, his tone sharp. Of course, Holmes. What do you need? I need you to visit the local clinic, Holmes replied, his voice firm. There's a particular treatment I've been reading about, an experiment of sorts. It will allow me to test a theory I've had regarding Parish's reaction. Watson looked confused, but he trusted Holmes implicitly. I'll go at once. Later that afternoon, Watson returned to the Baker Street flat with a small vial in hand, a mixture of chemicals he had obtained from the clinic. Holmes was waiting in the shadows of his study, his face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. Here it is, Holmes, Watson said, handing him the vial. This should do the trick. Holmes inspected the contents carefully, his eyes gleaming. with a mix of anticipation and calculation. Perfect. This should give us the answer we need. Watson watched as Holmes began to mix the chemical solution, then turned toward the other man. I don't quite understand, Holmes. What is this going to prove? Holmes didn't respond immediately. He was too focused, too deep in his thoughts. Finally, he looked up at Watson, his face set with determination. This solution contains a rare compound that can cause a temporary reaction in the nervous system. It's not harmful, but it does provoke certain involuntary responses: muscle tension, subtle tremors, changes in posture. By administering it in a controlled manner, we can observe whether it provokes an unconscious reveal of guilt. Parish is calm now, but this will force him to betray himself in ways his mind cannot control. Watson's eyes widened. You're going to use this on him? Holmes nodded. Not directly, no, but I'll have him unknowingly exposed to it, through something he drinks, perhaps. If he's guilty, the chemical will cause a reaction. His body will betray him, even if his mind tries to maintain composure. The next evening, Holmes and Watson returned to the station where Parish was being held, now under close surveillance. Holmes had arranged for a private interview, and they were granted access after a few moments of persuasion. Parish was seated, his face drawn, still maintaining the calm, composed demeanor that had masked his guilt for so long. As they entered, his eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He knew the game had shifted, but he couldn't quite place how. Mr. Parish, Holmes said, his voice measured and calm. I trust you're comfortable. Parish's lips tightened, but he nodded. I am, Mr. Holmes, though I fail to see why I am still being questioned after the arrest. My involvement in Lord Stanhope's death is clear. Holmes smiled faintly, taking a seat across from him. Yes, it seems to be. But we must ensure every angle is explored. After all, justice demands the full truth. He watched Parish closely, noting the way his eyes flicked toward the door, then back at Holmes. He was on edge, but hiding it well. Holmes motioned to a glass of water on the table. I do apologize for the inconvenience, but would you mind having a drink? I have a feeling you might need it to settle your nerves. Parish glanced at the glass briefly, his expression unreadable. I'm fine, thank you. Holmes leaned forward, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. I insist. You've been under a great deal of strain, and this will calm your mind. Please, don't deny it. Parish hesitated for only a moment, but his desire to maintain control over the situation won out. He reached for the glass, took a quick sip, and set it down. Holmes noted the subtle tension in his fingers, the tightness in his jaw. As the minutes passed, Holmes continued with his questions, letting the conversation drift in casual directions, probing for reactions. His eyes never left Parish, watching for the slightest change. At first, there was nothing, but then it came. The tremor, barely perceptible, in Parish's left hand. The minute shift in posture, as if his body had been caught in a sudden wave of discomfort. Holmes's heart quickened, but he didn't show it. Mr. Parish, there's one thing that still bothers me, he said smoothly, eyes locking with his suspect. You were always so confident, even in the face of such damning evidence. Tell me, why was it that you remained so calm, so unshaken after I accused you? Most men would be panicking, perhaps pleading, but not you. You stayed too composed. Parish's eyes flickered for the briefest moment. He opened his mouth to speak, but his words faltered as he swallowed hard. The chemical was working, slowly, subtly, but with undeniable results. His heart rate was increasing, his posture shifting, and now his hands were clenched, fighting against the involuntary tremors. Holmes leaned back, a small but victorious smile curling at the corner of his lips. "You've been deceiving everyone, Parish, but your body betrayed you, didn't it?" The man's face paled, the tremors growing more pronounced. The final cracks in his facade were showing. Holmes had pushed him just enough to reveal the fear beneath. It wasn't just the murder of Lord Stanhope he feared now. It was the truth, catching up to him, slowly but inevitably, and there was no place left for him to hide. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from tense to electric. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes piercing into Parish, who was now visibly sweating. The tremors had not stopped, and the man's mouth had gone dry. His attempts to regain composure were failing, and Holmes could see the walls closing in on him. "You were so sure of your innocence, Mr. Parish," Holmes said, his voice a low murmur. "But your body has betrayed you. And now, I think you know that your time is running out." Parish's lips quivered as he fought to maintain his composure, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the strain was too much. The calm facade he had so carefully constructed was crumbling piece by piece. Before he could say anything further, there was a sudden loud knock on the door, and Cray entered, his face pale and visibly shaken. "Holmes," the inspector said, barely able to meet his gaze. "There's been a problem." Holmes's heart skipped a beat, and he stood up immediately, his earlier composure replaced with a cold urgency. "What is it, Cray?" Cray's eyes darted toward Parish, still sitting in his chair, now nervously wringing his hands. "It's the evidence that was brought in earlier today, the one you were going over yourself, Holmes. It's gone, completely vanished." The words hit Holmes like a blow. He took a step back, his mind already racing. Parish had not been the only one who had underestimated the detective. Someone else, someone far more clever, had decided that. The case was slipping through their fingers, and they had acted quickly to silence it. "Explain," Holmes demanded, his voice sharp. Cray nodded, swallowing hard. "We had the envelope containing the victim's private letters, along with a number of financial records that linked Parish to a series of shady transactions. We placed it under lock and key, Holmes, but when I went to check it just moments ago, it was gone, no sign of a break-in, no trace of tampering, as though it had simply disappeared." Holmes's eyes narrowed, his mind already formulating 100 possible scenarios. This wasn't an ordinary theft. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that those documents were erased from existence, and it was no coincidence. A crucial piece of evidence had been removed, and with it, the path to the truth was suddenly much murkier. "Who else had access to the evidence room?" Holmes asked, his tone colder now. Cray's face reddened as he shifted uncomfortably. "Only the guards and myself." Holmes turned sharply toward Parish. "You've already made your move, haven't you? You orchestrated this entire thing, didn't you?" Parish's face remained impassive, but Holmes could see the faintest flicker of something in his eyes, fear, guilt, perhaps a hint of triumph. He was caught, but he wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. Holmes stood up straighter, the gears in his mind turning rapidly. This was no random theft. It was carefully planned, calculated. Whoever had stolen the evidence was well aware of the detective's methods, and they knew how to keep him on his toes. "Cray, I need you to recheck everything. The guards, the staff. Someone must have seen something. This isn't just a matter of an isolated theft. It's a deliberate move against the investigation. They want to bury the truth before we can uncover it. Cray nodded, looking both defeated and alarmed. I'll get on it right away, Holmes. But we've already combed through the entire building. We're running out of time. Not yet, Cray, Holmes replied, his mind racing as he paced the room. We must work quickly. Whoever is behind this is trying to stop us, but they've underestimated one thing. What's that? Watson asked, his voice quiet. They've underestimated the one thing they can't control, Holmes said, stopping to look directly at the inspector. Themselves. Holmes was already on his way to the evidence room. The vanishing of the critical documents was not an isolated incident. It was a deliberate message. Whoever had taken them wanted to instill fear, to make Holmes doubt his progress. But the detective knew that doubt was the enemy of the truth. As they reached the room, Holmes examined every corner. There were no signs of forced entry, no marks. On the door, no broken locks. It was as though the evidence had simply vanished into thin air. But Holmes knew better than to accept that explanation. He moved closer to the desk where the guards had reported seeing the envelope earlier. The surface was pristine, the chair undisturbed. But then his sharp eye caught something, a single, almost imperceptible mark on the edge of the drawer. It was too small to be noticed by anyone but Holmes. He knelt down and traced the mark with his fingers feeling the faintest indentation, a small scratch. Nothing remarkable on its own, but in Holmes's mind it was a clue, one that was far too subtle to have been left by accident. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice steady, "look here." Watson bent down to examine the mark. "What do you think it means, Holmes?" Holmes stood up, his mind racing. "It means the thief was close, very close, to getting what they wanted. But they made one mistake. They left something behind, a small clue that no one else would have noticed." Watson frowned. "But how does that lead us forward? This isn't enough to go on." Holmes smiled faintly. "Perhaps, Watson, but the mark isn't the key. The key is the action. Whoever took the evidence wasn't interested in simply hiding it. They wanted to send a message, and that message was directed at us." He looked around the room again, now more deeply aware of the shifting nature of the case. Every moment was bringing new layers of complexity. The thief had underestimated one thing. Their plan had failed to account for Holmes's relentless pursuit of the truth. Someone was playing a dangerous game, but Holmes had learned how to navigate through deception. "Cray," Holmes said, turning back to the door, "gather your men. We need to investigate every movement in this building tonight. No one leaves until we have answers." As Cray hurried off to follow his orders, Holmes turned back to the room. The evidence was gone, but it wasn't the end of the case. It was merely another beginning. The night had fallen heavy with uncertainty, and the quiet of the building seemed almost oppressive as Holmes stood in the heart of the now locked evidence room. The sense of urgency, the rising suspicion, and the relentless ticking of the clock gnawed at his concentration. Cray had rounded up the staff and guards, insisting that no one be allowed to leave. The search for answers had only just begun. Holmes was reviewing the marks on the desk again, every inch of the room scrutinized with meticulous care. Watson, equally absorbed in the task, had begun to look less like a passive observer and more like an active participant in the search. Together they pieced together the subtle elements that might betray the thief's movements. And then the scream came. It was a shrill, piercing cry that echoed down the hallway and rattled the walls. Holmes and Watson exchanged a glance, the realization hitting them simultaneously. It wasn't just any scream, it was the sound of terror. Without a word, they rushed toward the source of the noise, their footsteps quick and deliberate, the weight of the mystery still heavy on their minds. The closer they got, the more they could hear it. A commotion, a scuffle, and then a second scream, followed by a thud, as if someone had fallen. The air felt thick, like something terrible was unfolding just ahead. Cray was already there, breathless, standing at the door of a small office just off the hallway. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with panic. Holmes pushed past him, quickly, entering the room, where the scene laid bare the horror that had just unfolded. There, crumpled at the foot of a desk, lay a man, one of the guards. Blood pooled around him, dark and spreading across the floor. His eyes were wide open in shock, but there was no sign of life. The guard was dead, and the room was filled with an unmistakable sense of finality. Another murder, the second one in less than 24 hours. Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the scene quickly. It was another calculated move, the same chilling precision that had marked the first crime. No struggle, no mess, just a clean, deliberate kill. Who found him? Holmes asked, his voice taut with focus. Cray cleared his throat. I did, sir. I heard the noise from down the hall and rushed in. He was already... Holmes cut him off with a wave of his hand. Is there a weapon? Something used to kill him? Cray stepped aside, revealing the lifeless body, but there was no weapon in sight. The guard hadn't been shot or stabbed. He had been bludgeoned, perhaps, but the instrument of his death was nowhere to be found. Only a faint stain on the desk hinted that something had been placed there, likely a heavy object that had been swiftly removed after the crime. It's gone, Watson murmured, kneeling beside the body and examining the area with growing unease. The weapon, it was taken. Holmes stared at the desk, his mind racing. Another victim, another clue left behind but seemingly erased the moment the crime had been committed. Whoever was behind this was not simply leaving traces for Holmes to follow. They were making sure that every step was as elusive as the last. It was as if the entire investigation had become a game, and Holmes was being led down a twisted path where each clue only served to deepen the mystery. Could it be someone among us? Watson asked, his voice edged with concern. Perhaps someone who is trying to get us off the scent? Holmes turned to face him, his face unreadable. It's possible, he said quietly, but I believe this goes far deeper than we initially thought. Cray shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room. Do you think it's the same person, Holmes? The one who killed the woman? It's too soon to say, but the method, the lack of any attempt to make it appear like a struggle, it suggests a familiarity with the victim, a comfort with death. Holmes's gaze returned to the lifeless guard, and more importantly, the thief who took the evidence earlier might have underestimated the one thing they cannot control: timing. Watson looked up, the pieces starting to form in his mind. You think the murder was staged to divert attention? To send a message that the killer is still one step ahead of us? Holmes didn't respond immediately, his sharp eyes narrowing. There was something else at play here. The pattern of these crimes, the deliberate nature of each move. They weren't just random acts of violence. Someone had designed them with a purpose, calculated them to leave Holmes chasing shadows. We need to secure this area, Cray, Holmes said suddenly, snapping back into action. And I need you to put all staff under strict surveillance. We can't afford another mistake. This killer is playing a much larger game. As Cray nodded and left to carry out the orders, Holmes walked back to the desk, his mind still sharp and focused. He had underestimated the criminal before. He had assumed that the missing evidence would be the key. He had believed that once the document was recovered, everything would fall into place. But now, with the second murder, it was clear that the investigation was far more complex than he had imagined. Watson followed him, looking troubled. "Holmes, where do we go from here? The evidence we had is gone, and now there's a second murder. We've lost all the ground we gained." Holmes turned to Watson, his face unreadable, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. "We haven't lost anything, Watson. We've been given an opportunity." "An opportunity?" Watson repeated, bewildered. "How do you figure?" Holmes stepped toward the door, his mind already working through the next sequence of events. "The killer has made a mistake. They've left a clue behind, something they didn't anticipate. The path they've set us on is clear, and I intend to follow it no matter where it leads." Watson raised an eyebrow. "You're certain?" Holmes looked back at him, his expression unwavering. "As certain as I am that this killer is still in this building, and still watching us." There was no time to waste. The game had changed, but so had the rules. Holmes was no longer just investigating a crime, he was on the hunt, and the murderer was closer than ever before. The hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. Holmes had instructed Cray to continue his surveillance, keeping all suspects and witnesses under close watch. The entire building seemed to hum with a nervous energy, each person aware that something terrible was unfolding, but uncertain of how it would unfold next. The murderer remained at large, hidden among them like a shadow in the dark. Holmes, however, was not deterred by the chaos. He had seen worse, cases where the pieces of the puzzle were more scattered than they appeared, cases where the truth was deliberately obscured. He sat in the corner of the evidence room, the once clean surface now littered with notes, scribbled theories, and maps of the building. His mind was spinning through the web of clues, connections, and contradictions, searching for something, anything that could pull the disparate threads together. Watson, seated across from him, was studying the guard's body once again, but it was clear that his thoughts were not fully engaged. He glanced up occasionally at Holmes, unsure of what direction the detective was taking. The silence between them stretched for several moments until Holmes spoke, his voice cutting through. "The tension, Watson," he said slowly. "I think we've been looking at this all wrong." Watson looked up, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean? The murders? The missing evidence? Everything points to one killer." Holmes shook his head, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "Yes, but we've been assuming it's the same. Person behind everything, the missing evidence, the two murders, the manipulations. What if it's not?" Watson's confusion deepened, but Holmes wasn't finished. "We've overlooked something, Watson, something right in front of us. The pattern isn't as simple as a single person executing a plan with precision. No, there are multiple players at work here, each with their own motive, and it's only by understanding how they're linked that we'll start to see the true picture." Watson stood up, his eyes narrowing as he processed the detective's words. "You're suggesting that there's more than one person involved? But we've only been focused on one suspect, Parish." "Exactly," Holmes replied, his eyes sharp as ever. "Parish is a red herring. He's been too obvious, too eager to point fingers. In truth, he's a pawn in someone else's game. Someone with a much subtler touch, someone who has been pulling the strings from the shadows." Holmes's words hung in the air for a moment, and then Watson's face lit up with recognition. "You're talking about the stolen evidence, That's the key, isn't it? Someone didn't just take it to hide it, they took it to prevent someone from seeing the connection. Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile, but his eyes remained intense. Yes, Watson, the evidence was never about what it contained. It was about what it represented, the tipping point. Whoever removed it knew that once we found it, the entire pattern would come into focus. But they underestimated one thing: our persistence. Holmes stood up suddenly, his mind now fully in motion. He strode over to the map on the wall, tracing his finger along the points where the murders had occurred, where the evidence had been hidden, and where the most subtle clues had led. As he moved, Watson joined him, watching closely. "Let's think for a moment," Holmes continued. "The first victim, Mrs. Eliza Warren, was murdered under the pretense of a simple robbery gone wrong. The second victim, a guard who was working late, was killed in a similar fashion, with no apparent motive, no struggle, just a clean execution." Watson nodded, his brow furrowed. But both murders were too efficient. There was no emotional heat, no sign of a crime, of passion. These were professional hits, calculated. "Exactly," Holmes agreed, his eyes lighting up with a flash of insight. "But what if we're looking at this from the wrong perspective? These murders, while horrifying, were not meant to serve as an end in themselves. They were distractions, deliberate attempts to keep us off the scent. The real objective was always something more." Holmes's gaze shifted to the map. He studied the arrangement of rooms, the corridors, the offices, and the locations of the murders and disappearances. His finger hovered over a small, seemingly insignificant detail, an offhand comment made by one of the staff earlier in the investigation. It had seemed unimportant at the time, buried beneath the weight of the larger crime, but now it struck him like a lightning bolt. "Of course," Holmes muttered to himself, his voice rising with sudden realization. "The motive has always been right in front of us. The missing evidence, the strange behavior of the witnesses, even the isolated location of each crime. They all point to the same thing." Watson was silent for a moment, waiting for Holmes to elaborate. "This is about power, Watson," Holmes said, his voice gaining strength. "The missing documents were never about covering up a single crime. They were about controlling the narrative, shifting the focus away from what really matters. And the pattern is not random. It's a deliberate attempt to manipulate us, to keep us chasing our own tails." "But why?" Watson asked. "Why would anyone go to such lengths?" Holmes's eyes glinted with intensity. "Because this is not just about money or revenge or simple ambition. This is about preserving something far more dangerous, something that cannot be allowed to be uncovered." He looked up at Watson, his gaze unwavering. "I believe that the person who is behind these crimes is someone whose past is so tied to the events we're investigating that they will do anything to keep it buried. And it is through this connection to the past that we will find our answers." Watson's mind raced as Holmes's words began to form a clearer picture. "The past? You're saying these crimes aren't just happening in the present, they have roots in something that happened long ago?" Holmes nodded, his expression grim. "Exactly, Watson. The murderer, or rather the orchestrator of these crimes, is not acting on impulse. They've planned every detail with precision, and they've known from the very beginning that if we put the pieces together, we would uncover the hidden connection. But they've done everything to make sure we would never see it." A shiver ran down Watson's spine as the full weight of Holmes's insight hit him. The detective had been right all along. The case had not just been a simple investigation. It was a long-buried secret coming to the surface, one that could destroy lives if revealed. The stakes had grown higher, and the enemy was more ruthless than anyone had imagined. Holmes turned to Watson, his expression hardening with resolve. "We have to find the connection before it's too late. The next step in this investigation will bring us face to face with the truth, and with whoever is willing to do anything to keep it hidden." The tension in the room was palpable as Holmes and Watson pored over the final pieces of the puzzle. The detective had been meticulously connecting the dots, his mind racing through the intricate web of motives, alibis, and lies that had clouded their investigation. Now, as the last thread began to pull free, a chilling clarity settled over him. "This isn't about money, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low and grim. "It never was." Watson looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Holmes stood, his fingers lightly brushing the edge of the map that had consumed their attention for hours. The murders, the stolen evidence, the manipulations, all of it was meant to obscure one simple truth. The real motive isn't greed. It isn't revenge or power. It's far more insidious than that. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the faint rustle of papers as Holmes walked toward the desk, pulling out a set of documents he had earlier dismissed as irrelevant. He spread them out before Watson, each piece a small clue. A faint whisper from the past. "The missing evidence," Holmes continued, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of urgency, "was a personal vendetta. Not just against the victims, but against something far more ancient. The murderer has been trying to bury something that happened long ago, something that has been festering beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to rise." Watson leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What happened? What are you saying?" Holmes met his gaze, his eyes uncharacteristically cold. "This is about an old case, Watson. A case that was never fully solved. It dates back to a time when the victim's family, specifically a man named Gerald Thorne, was involved in a tragedy that left a deep scar in the town's history." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Watson's confusion deepened as he recalled the name. "Thorne? I don't recognize it." Holmes nodded, the expression on his face grim as he sifted through the papers before him. Gerald Thorne was a wealthy landowner. He was once well respected, but his reputation crumbled when his daughter, Isabella, was involved in a scandalous affair with a man named Thomas Carden. The affair was violent, tumultuous, and ultimately deadly. Isabella died under mysterious circumstances. Some say suicide, others claim foul play. Thomas Carden was never charged, but his life spiraled downward nonetheless. His connection to Isabella's death was never proven, and in the years that followed, the case was quietly forgotten. Watson's eyes widened with realization. "The murderer? They're connected to that case?" Holmes nodded gravely. "Yes, Watson, the murderers, the stolen evidence, the manipulations, these aren't random acts. They are an attempt to resurrect an old secret, one that has been buried for decades. The murderer isn't just seeking revenge. They're trying to avenge an injustice. But it goes deeper than that." He fell silent for a moment, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. Watson watched as his friend seemed to wrestle with something far more personal than he had expected. Holmes wasn't just solving a crime. He was unearthing a painful truth. "This is not just about retribution. Watson," Holmes continued, "the murderer believes that the death of Isabella Thorne was never fully avenged. They think that the wrongs done to her family, done to them, have been swept under the rug. The truth of what happened all those years ago has festered in their mind, a festering wound they have spent their life trying to heal. Watson shook his head, still struggling to fully grasp the enormity of what Holmes was suggesting. "You're saying that someone still living, was willing to kill to uncover this forgotten past. But why?" Holmes's eyes flashed with understanding, his voice softening for the first time in hours. "Because, for the murderer, the pain has never gone away. They have been living in the shadow of that tragedy for years. Their actions were not just about justice, it was about closure, a final reckoning, one that could absolve them of a life of guilt. They wanted to expose the truth. They wanted to make sure that the crimes of the past were recognized, no matter the cost." Watson exhaled sharply, the revelation hitting him with the force of a punch. The crimes they had been investigating, each seemingly random and disconnected, were all a part of an effort to bring an ancient wound to the surface. The murderer wasn't after wealth or power. They were after something far more elusive, the truth. "But Holmes, who is it?" Watson asked, his voice tense. "Who would go to such lengths to resurrect a ghost from the past?" Holmes paused, his expression pensive, and then he pointed to a name on the list in front of him. "It's someone who has been here all along, Watson, someone who has been hiding in plain sight." Watson leaned in, his heart racing. "Who?" "Gerald Thorne's granddaughter," Holmes said, his voice steady, but laced with the weight of inevitability. Margaret Thorne. The name hit Watson like a thunderclap. He had seen her, a quiet woman in her late 30s, rarely seen at the scene of the investigation, always keeping to the edges of the group. She had been there when they questioned the staff, when they had examined the evidence. But she had never been a primary suspect. "Margaret Thorne," Watson repeated, his disbelief palpable. "She was in on this. But why would she?" "Because, Watson, she has been living with the weight of her family's past for years," Holmes interrupted. "Her grandfather's death, her mother's isolation, the ruin of their name, all of it has been buried beneath layers of lies and secrets. Margaret Thorne was not just avenging an old wrong, she was cleansing her family's name." He paused, watching Watson's face as the pieces of the puzzle slowly clicked together. Margaret believed that if she could expose the truth of Isabella's death, it would undo the stain on her family's honor. But in her desperation, she went too far. She orchestrated the murders, the thefts, the deceit, all in the hope of resurrecting a past that could never be fixed. She had been patient, waiting for the right moment to strike, but in the end, she had only destroyed herself. Watson sat back in his chair, his mind reeling from the depth of the motive. But the psychological toll, the lengths she went to, it's unimaginable. Holmes nodded, his voice quiet as he regarded the papers before him. The tragedy of her family, of Isabella Thorne's death, has defined Margaret's life in ways no one could understand. The desire for justice, for closure, became an obsession. She believed that by righting that old wrong she could restore balance to her family's shattered legacy. "Is there any chance we can stop her?" Watson asked, his voice tense. Holmes stood, a glint of determination in his eyes. "We must, Watson. We cannot allow her to destroy any more lives in the name of a past that can never be undone." The truth, as always, was more complicated than it seemed. The motive had been buried beneath years of history, but now that it had been unearthed, Holmes knew that the final confrontation with Margaret Thorne was inevitable. Only time would tell if justice would truly prevail, or if the past would claim another victim. The cold evening air clung to the walls of the mansion as Holmes and Watson made their way through the quiet corridors, their footsteps echoing like a foreboding drumbeat. Holmes's mind was razor-sharp, every detail falling into place. Margaret Thorne had underestimated the detective. She had woven her lies so intricately, hidden behind a mask of grief and respectability. But Holmes knew her now, understood her motives, her obsession, her need to rewrite history, to vindicate a past that had consumed her. The time had come to confront her, to lay bare her twisted need for retribution. They had arranged the perfect trap, a dinner invitation, carefully orchestrated with just the right blend of familiarity and intrigue. Holmes had carefully timed everything, knowing that she would be drawn to the opportunity to confront her family's tragic legacy one last time. Margaret Thorne would not be able to resist the chance to manipulate the truth, to take control of her destiny. As they entered the drawing room, the soft crackling of a fire in the hearth provided an almost eerie backdrop to the tension in the room. Holmes motioned for Watson to remain silent, his gaze fixed on the grand staircase as they awaited her arrival. The night was thick with anticipation. "I know what you've been doing, Margaret," Holmes said quietly, his voice breaking the silence as the woman entered the room, her face a picture of calm composure. She was every bit the image of a woman in control, but Holmes could see the tremor in her eyes, the nervous flicker of someone who knew their time was running out. Margaret Thorne smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's eyes never left hers. "You've spent years trying to bury the past, to rewrite the wrongs done to your family. Your obsession with justice, with retribution, it's led you to kill, to deceive, to manipulate everyone around you. And now, you think you can walk away from it." Her composure faltered, but only for a moment. Her lips pressed together, and she took a step forward. "You're mistaken, Holmes. I've done nothing wrong. I've simply tried to bring closure to my family's disgrace." "A disgrace that was not yours to fix," Holmes replied, his voice steady. "Your need to avenge your mother's shame, your grandfather's downfall, it's driven you to madness. And now you've taken lives to satisfy a thirst for justice that was never truly yours to claim." Margaret's eyes narrowed, her fingers twitching slightly as if she were about to reach for something. Holmes noted the subtle movement, a sign of her increasing discomfort. He was getting to her, unraveling the wall she had so carefully constructed. "I never wanted to kill anyone," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But you don't understand, Mr. Holmes. The injustice, it's been eating at me my entire life. My family has been ruined because of one mistake, one man's crime, and no one has ever paid for it. No one but me." Holmes stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "And in your quest for justice, Margaret, you've only made the damage worse. You've become the thing you hated most, an executioner of your own making." Margaret's eyes flashed with anger, and in that instant Holmes knew that the confrontation was nearing its breaking point. She could either try to escape or face the consequences of her actions. Either way, she had reached the end of the line. Her voice grew cold as she took another step toward him. "You think you've solved everything, don't you, Holmes? You think you've figured me out. But you don't know the whole story. You don't know what I've been through." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "I know enough, Margaret. You've spent years spinning your web of lies, trying to force the past into a shape that makes sense to you. But the truth, the real truth, is that you've been running from it for so long that you've become blind to it. Your family's legacy cannot be rewritten by bloodshed. She stiffened, her hand reaching for something at her waist. Holmes's instincts flared, and in that instant, everything became clear. Margaret was not done. She still believed that there was one last chance to turn the tide, one last effort to take control of the narrative she had shaped so carefully. With a swift motion, Margaret pulled a small vial from her pocket, a vial of poison, the very thing she had planned to use to erase the truth one final time. Holmes's eyes locked onto it, his mind already calculating the next move. "I didn't want it to end this way," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "But I have to. You understand, don't you? The past, it's everything." Holmes didn't hesitate. With a fluid motion, he reached out, disarming her with practiced ease, his fingers twisting the vial from her hand. Watson had already moved into position, and before Margaret could react, he had restrained her with the firm grip of authority. "No, Margaret," Holmes said, his voice soft but resolute. "It's not the past that defines us. It's how we move forward." Margaret Thorne's defiance crumbled in that moment. Her shoulders sagged, the weight of her years of deception crashing down on her. The room seemed to grow colder, the fire's warmth now a distant echo in the background as the truth finally began to sink in. The door to the drawing room opened, and a group of constables, who had been waiting outside at Holmes's signal, stepped in to take control of the situation. The trap had worked. The final confrontation had been set, and the villain was now in custody, the twisted narrative she had spun finally coming to an end. As the constables led Margaret away, Holmes turned to Watson, his expression unreadable. The detective was a master of his craft, always able to see the patterns others missed, always knowing when the time was right to strike. But even he could not hide the weariness in his eyes as the reality of the case settled around him. "It's over, Watson," Holmes said quietly, his voice reflecting a deep, almost imperceptible sadness. "The past can never be rewritten, and we must learn to accept that. Sometimes the truth is a burden we must bear, no matter how heavy." Watson nodded, understanding the weight of his friend's words. The case was closed, but the scars left behind would remain. As always, Holmes had solved the mystery, but at what cost? The consequences of justice, it seemed, when Nev Holmes stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the dimming light of the setting sun. The mansion, now quiet and still, seemed to hold its breath. The investigation had reached its conclusion. Margaret Thorne, the twisted architect of so many lives ruined, was in custody. The evidence had been damning, her confession complete. Watson stood beside him, a quiet satisfaction in his gaze. But there was an edge to Holmes's demeanour that Watson had come to recognize only in the most complex cases. The flicker of doubt that refused to settle. "I trust you're satisfied, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice laced with a gentle concern. "Not yet, Watson," Holmes replied softly, his eyes still fixed on the distant horizon. "There's something off. You can't hear it, can you? The silence before the storm." Watson frowned. "What are you saying? The case is done. We have her confession, the motive, everything that we need. Surely," Holmes held up a hand, silencing his friend. "You're right, Watson. The case, by all appearances, is solved. But you see, my dear friend, it never quite feels like a true resolution until every question has been answered. and something, somewhere, is still nagging at the back of my mind. Before Watson could respond, a sudden commotion echoed from the hallway, a loud crash followed by muffled voices. The constables, still at the scene, sounded alarmed. Holmes turned sharply, his instincts kicking in. He moved toward the door, with a speed that belied his usual calm. "Stay here, Watson," he commanded, though his tone was urgent. "I'll see what's happening." Within moments, Holmes was at the heart of the disturbance, where two constables were struggling with a figure who had just emerged from the shadows. A familiar face, one he had dismissed, assuming them to be an innocent bystander in the case. "Release him at once," Holmes ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. The constables hesitated, but they obeyed, pulling away to reveal none other than Charles Thorne, the very man whose death had begun the chain of events that led to this investigation. Charles Thorne, alive and standing before them. Holmes felt the weight of the revelation settle on him like a physical blow, and yet, in the pit of his stomach, he had known. There was no way Margaret Thorne, in her desperation to avenge a family destroyed, could have been the sole architect of this twisted tale. The true mastermind had always been closer than anyone had imagined. Charles Thorne met Holmes's gaze with a sly smile that only added to the growing unease in the room. His appearance, though somewhat dishevelled, was unmistakable. "He had been hiding in plain sight all along. You thought me dead, didn't you, Holmes?" Charles's voice was smooth, almost mocking as he looked around at the stunned constables. "But you, the great detective, should know better than anyone that nothing is as it seems." Holmes didn't respond immediately. His mind raced, piecing together the puzzle in ways he had not considered. This was not just a matter of family revenge, of a daughter avenging her father's disgrace. No, this was a far more intricate game. A game of manipulation, deceit, and long-term planning that had spanned far beyond Margaret's simple thirst for vengeance. Margaret Thorne had believed her father was dead, his body buried under the weight of his crimes, a tragic casualty of his own fall from grace. But Charles Thorne had faked his death, orchestrating a complex scheme that allowed him to stay hidden for years. All the while, Margaret had believed she was alone in her quest for justice. Little did she know, her every move, her every decision had been carefully steered by the man she thought she had lost forever. "Why the deception?" Holmes finally asked, his voice low, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "Why put your own daughter through this? Why all the years of manipulation?" Charles Thorne's smile faded, and a darkness clouded his eyes. "I had to watch her, Holmes. I had to see her believe the lie that she was cleaning up the family name. It was the perfect cover, you see. All these years, she did my bidding without ever realizing she was playing right into my hands." Watson stood frozen in the doorway, shock etched on his face. "But why? Why would you—" Charles turned to him, his eyes glinting with malice. "Because, Watson, when you've lost everything, your reputation, your wealth, your place in the world, you'll do anything to claw your way back to the top. And that's exactly what I'm doing now. My daughter, my dear Margaret, has been my unwitting pawn in a much larger scheme. She thought she was avenging me. But I've been working behind the scenes all along to ensure that the legacy of the Thorne family is restored, no matter the cost." The magnitude of the revelation hit Holmes with the force of a freight train. The web of deceit stretched far beyond a mere familial rivalry. This was a man whose desperation to restore his name, had driven him to orchestrate not just one but two murders. And now, with Margaret's involvement, he had ensured that the investigation would go exactly as planned, without anyone ever suspecting his true role. But Holmes had been too focused on the surface, on the motives of those closest to the crime. He had missed the true player, the one pulling the strings from the shadows. The discovery of Charles Thorne's survival was nothing short of a final, devastating twist in a case that had already defied every expectation. "You've played your game well, Thorne," Holmes said, his voice cold. "But you've underestimated one thing, me." Holmes was already moving, his mind working furiously as he calculated their next steps. Margaret had been manipulated, but she wasn't beyond redemption. The truth of her father's machinations would be the final nail in the coffin of his elaborate deception. As Charles made a futile attempt to flee, his steps faltering under the weight of his own downfall, Holmes gestured to the constables. "Don't let him get away," he ordered firmly. "We have unfinished business, and I'm not finished yet." In that final moment, as the constables closed in and Charles Thorne was taken into custody, Holmes felt the tension of the past days finally start to unravel. The game was over. The villain had been unmasked, again, and the detective's brilliance had been tested to the very last. But even in the face of victory, Holmes knew this. In the world of crime, the last-minute twist was never truly the end. It was only the beginning of the next mystery waiting to be solved, as clear-cut as they appeared. The evening sky had long darkened, and the once bustling mansion now sat eerily still, as if holding its breath in the wake of revelations that had shaken its foundations. Charles Thorne had been arrested, but the feeling of finality, of justice, being served, seemed far from certain. Holmes sat at the edge of the drawing-room, his gaze focused on the faint flickering of the fireplace, his mind still reeling from the complexity of the case that had played out over the past several days. "Holmes," Watson said, his voice low, his hand resting on the back of a chair, "I can't help but feel that there's something unsettled about all this. We've caught Thorne, but somehow the ending feels incomplete." Holmes's eyes, usually so sharp and perceptive, seemed distant for a moment. He nodded slowly, his fingers idly tapping the armrest of his chair. "I understand your concern, Watson, and I share it." He looked up, his gaze now steady, his mind snapping back into its usual sharp focus. "But you must understand, the truth of this case is far more elusive than it first appeared. While Thorne may have confessed, his motivations are far more complicated than any of us initially suspected. His survival, his manipulation of Margaret, the way he orchestrated this entire drama, it all leads back to a deeper, darker scheme. Then why does it feel like there's something left unaccounted for?" Watson pressed, his brow furrowed. "The case seems finished, yet I can't shake the feeling that something is still hidden." Holmes leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and his fingers steepled in front of him. "You're right, Watson. There is one final detail that remains unsolved, something that escaped our notice during our investigation." His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he was already piecing together the fragments of a puzzle. "I spoke to Thorne before his arrest," Holmes continued, his voice taking on a tone of quiet certainty. He was not as nervous or shaken as a man in his position should have been. His composure, almost too perfect, told me that he had already considered the possibility of his capture. What he didn't expect was the depth of my investigation. He was confident in his escape, not just from the law, but from the consequences of his actions. Escape? Watson repeated, incredulous. You don't think... Holmes held up a hand, cutting Watson off. No, Watson. Not physically. I believe Thorne's plans were always meant to succeed, no matter the outcome of his capture. You see, the real crime was never about murder or revenge. It was about manipulation, control, and creating a new identity, a legacy beyond his own death. Watson's confusion deepened. But we have him, Holmes. He's confessed. The evidence is overwhelming. What more could there be? Holmes stood up, walking to the window and gazing out into the darkened night. When we first encountered this case, I believed we were chasing the ghost of a man whose thirst for revenge had driven him to such extremes that he would use his own daughter as a pawn. I still believe that. But what I failed to recognize was that there was no ghost to chase. Thorne was never truly dead, only a manufactured version of him was. And the final piece of his game was always to ensure that no matter what, he would live on. Watson's face twisted in confusion, but Holmes continued, his voice quiet and measured. The motive, Watson, was never just about bringing his family back into power. It was about creating a myth, a man who could return from the dead, orchestrating events from the shadows, watching everyone around him move in exactly the way he planned. Even his own daughter was a part of that plan. She, like the rest of us, never understood the truth. She thought she was avenging a dead man. But the reality was that Charles Thorne had set the stage for his rebirth before he ever died. Watson swallowed, his mind trying to process the depth of Holmes's analysis. But that still doesn't explain why he would go to such extremes: murder, deception, years of hiding. Holmes's lips twisted into a small, knowing smile. It explains it perfectly. The power of myth is that it's not bound by time or space. Thorne's legacy was never meant to be a small affair. It wasn't just about his daughter's revenge. It was about creating a narrative that would haunt generations to come. His death, his disappearance, the supposed downfall of the Thorne family, all of it was carefully designed. The world would never know the truth, only a story. And the truth, Watson, is something Thorne could control, even from behind bars. Watson was silent for a moment, the weight of Holmes's words settling in. So you're saying that even now the game isn't over? That Thorne could still manipulate the outcome? Holmes turned to face his friend, a sharp glint in his eye. Precisely. Thorne's confession, his capture. These are the final moves in a game where the rules are not as simple as they appear. He's given us what we wanted, but there's a deeper game at play, and for that, we may never have all the answers. Watson shook his head in disbelief. But what about Margaret? She's been duped, Holmes. Does she not deserve justice? Justice is never so simple, Watson, Holmes replied, his tone turning more somber. Margaret's role in all of this is tragic, but her fate is a consequence of the myth her father created. She, too, is a victim, one who will have to reckon with the truth of her father's manipulations, and that is her punishment in a way. The room fell silent as both men absorbed the weight of their conversation. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the only sound that seemed to fill the space between them. Outside, the night stretched on, indifferent to the turmoil within the walls of the mansion. Holmes turned back to the window, his face a mask of quiet contemplation. There is a final irony, Watson. In the end, Thorne's greatest victory wasn't in his crimes. It was in the legacy he left behind. Even as he rots in a cell, he is immortal. His myth, the idea of a man who returned from the dead, will linger for generations. And that, I suppose, is his true triumph. Watson nodded slowly, the truth of the words sinking in. So you believe justice has been served, but the villain has still won in the end. Holmes turned to look at him, a sad smile on his face. Indeed. Perhaps justice is not always about what we can see, but what we choose to believe. And sometimes, Watson, the greatest victories are the ones that no one ever sees coming. As the night deepened and the fire slowly burned out, Holmes and Watson sat in the quiet of the room, each lost in their own thoughts. The case had been solved, and yet in the back of their minds, the lingering shadows of Charles Thorne's manipulations would remain, an unsettling reminder that some truths were never meant to be fully understood.